The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So hello everyone. I think it's about time we can start this webinar. So first of all, let me give you a very warm welcome to this SPR webinar. The SPR Communications Committee is really happy to welcome you to this. That's the fourth SPR webinar of this year. My name is Alex Vaz, so I'll be your pilot captain for today. And we are really happy that today's webinar will be held by Jan Boehnke. I'm sorry, Jan, if I butchered your name just now. You can correct me later. He is from the University of Dundee in Scotland, and he will talk to us about peer review. And before we start, I'd just like to briefly review with you some of the webinar tools. The first webinar tool is to raise your hand and ask a question. You should be able to do this in your dashboard on the right side of your screen. There's a little hand raising button. Can everyone please try and click on it now so that we can see that it's working? Okay, I'm seeing some hands. Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so you can put them down. Thank you. And so this indicates that you have a question. So if you do indicate that, I can pass the microphone to you if you want to ask Jan a question directly. Or alternatively, if you have a question, you can also put them in the questions tab that you have there down in the screen. And if you write a question there, I'll later read it out loud to Jan and to everyone else. And there will be time for questions and discussion at the end of the talk and whenever our speaker finds it most appropriate. So, without any further ado, here is our webinar. Jan, can you hear us and can you talk?
Yes, I can, I think. Hi,
Great.
everyone. Yeah, thank you for the great introduction, Alex, and thank you for your great job in hosting this, and also many thanks to SPR inviting me to do this. I just counted, it's the 11th year of my membership. I'm sitting here in the 2008 Barcelona conference t-shirt, so it's been always a great inspiration of my work. So I'm really happy to do this work today. As Alex said, we will be talking about peer review. And most of the things I'm going to be talking about are fairly generic, at least for clinical psychology, and most of social sciences. Some specific bits about psychotherapy research, but I think, I hope it will be applicable wide and broadly. With view to myself, I'm not going to dwell on this a lot, but I think compared to other webinars where people present their own research program, it's maybe not quite as apparent why I might be talking about peer review to you. So I was happy enough to receive PhD review training during my PhD time already, and Wolfgang Lutz's unit in Trier. So that's what first introduced me to this. And since then, I was lucky enough to find more and more mentors who helped me developing these skills. And we'll come back to Pablons if you're interested in what I review and so on. There's a profile where you find all I've done. More pertinently to the talk today, since for 2 years now, I'm a member of the advisory editorial board of psychotherapy research, which basically means that I have to deliver on 6 manuscripts reviews per year. And I was an associate editor and I'm now the co-editor-in-chief of Quality of Life Research, a journal which in some respects does similar things in the medical field as psychotherapy research does, especially the feedback and monitoring thing. So I'm very happy that you all found the headline of the talk appealing. So this paper is desperate. It comes from a very great and humorous paper in environmental microbiology where the editors put together some of the best comments of their year 2010 that they found in the reviews. And as entertaining as these are, I think it's clear that we would all not like to have such, and probably we also wouldn't feel very good about providing these to any author of a manuscript that we present. That's a good start to think about how and why would you be writing reviews. So that's mainly then introducing to the structure of the talk today, becoming and being a reviewer, some general considerations about that might mostly be known to you. Then some quite specific, not quite hands-on since it's virtual, training on how to perform a review. We'll talk about the recommendation at the end of a review as a specific point, and then depending on time, I have some general points to end with, and to kick off some further debate if necessary. I'm definitely stopping at the end of each of these sections for questions, and I'm just hoping that Alex would flag up if there is an urgent need or anything in between, and I'm happy to stop then as well if questions just arise in the multiples of the participants. So without further ado, becoming and being a reviewer and the publication process. Well, once you have submitted a paper, it's not quite clear to everyone sometimes what's happening then. So with most journals, when you submit, there is already quite a bit of pre-processing going on before it even reaches the editors of the journal. So for example, the editorial staff of a journal might apply quite rigorous tests for ethics, so whether all the authors are named, whether it's clear what the contributions are, whether ethical approval for all parts of the study was obtained, and all these kinds of things. They are often tested before it even reaches any scientific advisor of the journal. And once that has happened, and potentially revisions have been made already at this stage, a paper reaches the editor-in-chief or main editor or whatever it is called at the specific journal. And that person will then pre-screen whether the manuscript actually matches the scope of the journal and give it a basic review of whether the quality and the argument presented, the methods used, and so on, are up to the quality standards of the specific journal itself. And at that stage already quite a number of manuscripts get rejected, and often, and especially this is often due to scope. So that's one of the things that oneself can try to maximize chances in being really good at trying to select the optimal journal, so that doesn't happen. But from my experience, that happens still quite a lot. So the editor-in-chief then makes decisions in terms of allocating it, for example, to an associate editor who will then handle the rest of the process, sending it out to reviewers, aggregating the reviewers' opinions, and managing the revision and potentially the publication process. So this this differs across journals sometimes, so that may be an editorial board decision, so several people already at that stage decide whether to send on or not, when not only one editor. Once the paper is accepted, for example, it might go back to the editors-in-chief, whether they really want it, and so on. But in principle, this is largely the picture that happens in most journals. And once the paper has gone over the pre-screening hurdle, it is then sent out to review, and then hopefully reviews are received. So just from my experience, it takes quite a while to find reviewers. We'll come back on that point. And once the reviews are in, the editor, associate editor, or whoever that is in that specific journal evaluates the manuscripts and the reviews, potentially asks for more reviews if they are vastly different or something like that, and then the editor takes a decision which can lead to a continuation of this nice circle for revision and revision and revision, or the rejection, or at some stage, or publication, which we obviously are always looking for. So why would you engage with this process? The soft and woolly reasons for that are, for example, you benefit from it to some degree. So if you review for the right journals, meaning well-selected journals for what you are doing, you have a constant opportunity to see ongoing research in your field. And especially the introduction sections of all these papers, they provide you always with new ideas, recent literature, new studies, and you're pretty up to date what is going on in the specific part of your discipline. What I definitely learned is how to write or not to write a paper. So I think that definitely has impacted a lot on my writing practice, to read so many different manuscripts. And in some ways, although it's moderated by the editors, it's also a kind of a knowledge exchange and scientific debate that you engage in. That's maybe not as lively as at a conference, but it's also an exchange of opinions and knowledge, really. But the main reason is basically, as long as you want to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, there's no real way out of that. Yeah, so because I would say is a more moral obligation to actually review, but might have different opinions on that. But 2 examples on how the relation between reviewers and papers is. Kovanis et al. References here and at the end of the presentation, which I'll upload on ResearchGate later. They estimated the burden of peer review for biomedical sciences in 2015, and they came to the conclusion that the supplies of reviewers that were actually available vastly exceeded the demand, but only 20% of the reviewers performed between 70 and 95% of the reviews. And they tried also to estimate the millions of hours that were spent on that. So, it's a data merging exercise and simulation study. So there's some salt in these numbers to take with, but still, even if we divide by 10, it's not very positive. And Publons.com, which is a tool and platform to document your review activity, looked into the reviews that were documented on their page for 2015. And in the biomedical sciences, 20% of the participating reviewers did 50% of the documented reviewers. And for the non-biomedical sciences, that was even more so. So yeah, there is an imbalance. And if you want the peer review and benefit from that, you probably should reciprocate. So then a question, when to become a reviewer? Should you feel obligated? Well, I think generally the criterion would be once you have successfully published a couple of papers. That's on the one hand a quality indication of some sort for the editors if they don't know you, to say, yeah, well, the person probably knows what they're talking about. But on the other hand, it's really just so that you have gone through the process yourself, just to know how difficult it can be in terms of an appreciation of what is asked of you as a reviewer, actually. And contrary to the expertise argument, on the other hand, we have, especially, for example, in the past years when text mining and things like that came into the more social sciences and health sciences, the only people who really could review the methods of these papers were PhD students, often developing these methods at the time. So there's no clear-cut criterion. And for yourselves, if you have signed up to a journal, if you have offered yourself as a reviewer for each of the requests that you would be given, you could still always decline and say, no, it's not your area, or you don't feel comfortable of reviewing something like that. Yeah, so that leads to the question how to become a reviewer. The thing that nobody can stop you from is signing up to a journal of your choice that you're interested in, where you read your work and inspire your work from, and sign up as a reviewer. Provide a detailed profile so that editors can find you actually when they're looking for keywords in their reviewer database, and then you're likely to be in. Yeah. Another thing is obviously presenting work at conferences, which makes editors and other authors aware of your work. And just a hint on that, as a editor scouring conferences for reviewers, would be good if you had a summary of your poster around or something like that, or a card after presentation or whatever, so that I actually can contact you afterwards. Unless you don't want to be, obviously, for reviews, I'll have work for you. And the main thing is quite clearly write and submit papers. As soon as you're in a database as an author, review requests will come. And what I've never done, but what colleagues said, is that they had been approached by people who are said that they would just like to be reviewers for the journal. Has never happened to me. I've never done that. But if you're that type, that's certainly also a way to do that. Once you have the invitation to do a review, there's the question whether you should review the specific paper. And well, the first thing is to decide whether the manuscript matches the area of your expertise based on the abstract that you have available. And that can be either the subject area, so the content the paper is dealing with, or the methods that they're applying. Yeah, so either could be enough to work as a reviewer on that specific aspect, would obviously be better if you can comment on both, but we'll come back to that. Next thing is, do you have a conflict of interest? Depending on career stage, that may easily happen. Patents, licenses. Have you recently collaborated or even published with that with the team of authors of that manuscript? In case that's not double-blind review, that is. And if you're, for example, on a panel that decides to give research money to a certain group of people, from funding agency and so on, you're probably not the best one to review the outcomes of that research. Just to give some examples, it doesn't happen that often. It's more the collaboration aspect that's sometimes difficult. Next thing, we come back to timelines. Do you have the time to provide the review on time? That's important. We all know about the length of reviews, but that's very important to consider. Are you familiar with the scope of the journal and their peer review process? So does what you would write about the paper actually fit what the journal wants? And do you have the time to re-review the manuscript? So because there's a certain expectation that if you provide a review, that you would also review the manuscript. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but it comes from the question of conflicts of interest, and we'll come back to that later. But most journals do have ethics codes beyond the COPE guidelines, for example, that I mentioned earlier in terms of that deal with publishing ethics. They pertain to some degree to reviews as well. SPR, Psychotherapy Research, has a specific document and our ethical code for authors, reviewers, and editors on their page. And I think that points out quite obvious things like giving an unbiased consideration, flagging up conflicts of interest, base recommendations in the best scientific practice that you know, and so on. So it's pretty clear, but sometimes it might be good to remind oneself of that. So wherever your decision is with a specific review request, always try to reduce delays. So even if you're unsure about whether you want to review it or not, just say no if that's still a likely outcome, and signal to the editor that he or she has to look somewhere else. And if you decline, it would be great if you could suggest somebody else. But yeah, the main point is, I think, signal early and as quickly as possible. So I don't know, Alex, are there some questions that would be about the general setting in which the review would happen and some considerations when to take a review or not? So is there anything?
Yeah, so if anyone has any question, now is one opportunity that people can inquire you. So you have, as I told you before, the possibility of putting your little hand up or in the questions tab asking something. So let's just see if anyone wants to ask anything so far. I think you're good to go for now.
Okay. Yeah, I will. Thank you. So then we'll come to the more specific bit on how to actually perform the review. And I think one of the first things that you should take to heart is that you shouldn't be fooled by the style and form of the manuscript that you're looking at. And that's also then connecting to the two main basic functions that peer review has. I mean, on the one hand, it's quality control, so a very nicely presented paper can be full of methodological flaws and everything. And here the task of the reviewer is obviously to ensure that limitations are fairly spelled out, or if the paper is even rejected, if it is beyond can't be redeemed in any way. And the other thing is that a very good study can be poorly reported. And then the main task of the reviewer could be to help authors to communicate the ideas and findings much more clearly. Most of the reviews will be somewhere in between, but I think that's quite important to be aware of both of these goals. And I mean, you will find on the internet loads and loads of recommendations how to structure a review. I think what works really well across a broad range of disciplines, and also in terms of structuring it for yourself to think about this, is this very simple 4-step structure. You start with a brief summary of the research. You provide an appreciation of the work, tell somebody, the editor in that case, what's good about it. And then you come to the points and explain them in more detail that you think would be major points and minor points that need addressing. And the main thing about the general style, or how you approach this, is obviously that you try to be as constructive and friendly in a way as possible. And that's, for example, also mentioned as one of the points in the psychotherapy code of ethics for reviewers. But that's also, I mean, it's always, like in many these ethical situations, it's good to think about how would you like to be approached, what would you like to read, and then you're halfway there already with the style, I think. Other general considerations are that generally it's common to address the comments to the editor, not to the authors, but that's probably a style decision. I've read both. Mainly it's addressing the editor whom you are supporting and making a decision about the manuscript. Within the sections of major and minor points, it's often helpful to organize just in order of appearance to give it some structure, but that may really depend on the specific paper, but that may be helpful. And be very clear about where the changes need to be made, which passages you refer to, because it's sometimes very difficult, also as an editor, but as an author as well, to find what reviewers are referring to, where they are taking the point that they are critiquing from. And on the other hand, for us authors, it's also then important to say sometimes, okay, I should have provided page and row numbers, for example. That would have made the task really easy to point this out. Well, then in conveying the points, try to use clear and matter-of-fact language. Just state clearly what you think needs addressing and give a suggestion on how this should be addressed. We'll come back to that in a couple of slides. And it's also good to think about, for each point that you raise, have you clarified for both the authors as well as the editor how a response would actually look like? So what you think a response should entail. So starting writing a review is, I think, it's not necessarily the first thing you do, but because you have to have read the whole manuscript in depth, but I mean, usually it is quite helpful to start the overall document with a summary of the research, which gives, in your words and your view, to the editor on the main research question and purpose. That's in the paper, the effective N. So for example, whatever units they're looking at, papers, patients, respondents, whatever, that can be very different, for example, from the number that's mentioned in the abstract. And a hint regarding samples, unit of analysis, and the applied methods to analyze data. And I mean, just structurally, it's helpful to include the title and the manuscript number, or at least the title, because even in the age of electronic submission systems and so on, I have seen allocations of reviews going wrong. And that is then obviously helpful to find out that this review obviously doesn't belong to the paper that we're looking at. So this summary provides the reviewer obviously with a chance to validate his or her reading against yours and potentially other reviewers, so that that helps to create a common understanding of what the paper actually does. And it's also good to follow that up because it also changes your view on the paper. Often, at least I find that for myself, if you have to write something positive about the paper. So obviously, writing style and presentation, that can be good and so on. But is there something that is really good practice, that's innovative? Did they tackle a really difficult problem? Even if you think in the end they didn't succeed, they still tried it. Do you think this will be really impactful in terms of scientific or public debate on a topic or something like that? These things can be highlighted and given some positive appreciation. I give here some placeholder examples. I give you a couple of half a minute or so to read that through. And so that's kind of the structure that I'm thinking about. So that's basically my own structure that I start with. Say which manuscript, I give a couple of sentences around what was done, what was assessed, and a summary of the findings. And in this case, it would have been quite positive, I think. If this were a paper, there's not much, depending on what's set on the sample. But something like that, just to give an overall impression, and then you can move on to the paper itself. And it's usually, as I said, helpful to go through the points in order of appearance. So checking the introduction, it's the main question, obviously, is it comprehensive in terms of the summary of the state of the current research? Is there evidence of bias in the presentation of the literature? Opposing research not mentioned. Sometimes, if you're interested, especially, but even in other cases, just web searching the title and some keywords from the paper in well-known and not endorsed search platforms can help to find a number of papers that might actually be very interesting and provide a different view. Is the information provided enough to understand the topic and research question? So in psychotherapy research, would somebody usually reading this paper really get what the problem is and why you're honing in on that? And consequently, does it clarify why the research is important, and does it spell out how it contributes to the current understanding? Two of the points, opposing research as well as the practical applicability, they are things that also may sometimes be much more appropriate to address in the discussion. We'll come back to that there, but at either place they have to happen. Otherwise, it's just something lacking. Then the main point at the angle point between the introduction and the methods section is then obviously that clear research questions and potentially hypotheses, clearly testable hypotheses, are provided. And the main question for a reviewer is, do these actually follow from what is presented in the introduction? Does it basically lead clearly to those questions? So the methods section for me, but I'm very methods leaning. I think it's probably the most important thing of a paper. There may obviously be people who disagree. Obviously methods alone doesn't really carry research, but still in this, that's a crucial part since it tells every reader what was done, how it was done, why it was done, and to some degree makes the building blocks of the study available to everyone. And if that doesn't work, the best introduction or the best discussion really can't redeem this. So the main point is there that a clear rationale should be provided as to how the different methods and the different elements connect to the research questions and hypotheses. And some concrete questions you could ask yourself doing this is the design, which includes sample, methods, manipulation, comparison group, etc., appropriate to address the research questions that have been posed at the end of the introduction? Is the sample adequate and the sampling adequately described? And especially if there is some analysis, and in our disciplines usually is the strategy sufficiently described? Does it address the research question? And potentially, if you're not an expert on that, does it require specialist quantitative or qualitative review, which you can flag up? I'll come back to that in some slides. And as I said, so the whole point is that the reader understands the building blocks and how the analysis was done. And basically what you should be able to form is a mental picture of what has been happening, even if you can't do everything yourself or understand everything completely. You need to know what was done at what point. That is obviously to some degree related to questions of replicability and so on. You may or may not be aware of the discussions, especially in psychology in general, going on about this. And I think also coming from clinical research and medical research, there will be some substantial changes, especially in how we perform and report confirmatory research. And there's then one-to-one match between the methods sections and anything that you do around confirmatory research. But at the moment, it's really mainly about making sure that every element is described. And since a lot of our studies in this field deal with interventions, I mean, the interventions need to be clearly spelled out, so that we can find them and define them in future research. Yeah, when reviewing that, it's important you do not need to know or understand each of the elements. That's not necessarily the very first task. The first task is to see that every element is there, and that you could say, yeah, probably somebody understanding all the elements can do the same thing. But every question that you as a reviewer, regardless of how dumb it seems to you maybe, or how fearful you are, it might seem dumb, that you can raise at this point about clarifying how the logical steps and so on are provided from getting the first patient to doing the last step of the analysis, they're absolutely fair to ask, and they will always help to clarify the message and to make communication better. And again, it's your responsibility to identify whether you can competently comment on each of the elements. If you can't, that's something to flag up to the handling editor, and he or she then can decide whether it needs further scrutiny. How to do that, I'll show you in a couple of slides. So two very simple examples. They are simple and simplified, but I definitely do read papers, also published ones, obviously, with such sentences, and I may be guilty of omissions or such weak describing in some papers on other sections that I didn't care that much about maybe. But for example, you read in a paper, patients received 16 sessions of CBT. That is, in our context, rarely sufficient. We want to know who were the patients who delivered the treatment, how long were the sessions, did the sessions follow a manual protocol? If so, can we describe it? Can we read it somewhere, and so on? Or a more methodological question that you might or might not know about, missing data were dealt with via multiple imputation. The only thing that you need to know as a reviewer is that that doesn't tell you anything. Multiple imputation is a very broad field. So questions would be, how much data was actually missing? Which of the different techniques that are or comprise multiple imputation were actually used? Which variables were used to impute missing values, and so on? So these are the kinds of questions, and these are the kinds of things that need explication and explanation in the method section. So another thing is coming back to the point about structuring your review and making clear what to respond to. And I'll give you this section to read, which you could read in a review. Obviously, it's cleaned, no details. It comes from a real review of mine. It's a contrived example from that. And maybe, I mean, that's, Alex, maybe another moment where we can try to interact here. If you would show up your hand or something like that, if you want to comment on that, how you think this is maybe not optimal or what you would change. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on.
Yeah, so again, I'm sorry for always repeating this, but you can always raise your hand on the platform here, or you can put up something on the chat or on the questions tab. So feel free to do that.
No hands?
I think everyone is still digesting the text, and you're also too crystal clear, Jan. So if you want to continue, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, then, yeah, so from my experience, the only thing that authors would usually respond to is this very last bit. If you provide such a paragraph in your review, finally it is known that comorbid physical and long-term conditions have an effect on outcome as well. The response of the reviewers for this whole paragraph, of the authors for this whole paragraph would read, oh yeah, thank you for this important consideration. We added several references regarding long-term conditions, and not using, going back to any of these points. I hope I'm not giving you ideas on how to deal with reviews in the future, but yeah, you can use the things I tell you here, obviously, in both directions. What it should look like is something like that. Yeah, so you, just by structure, clarifying to which of the points the authors need definitely to respond. So here is something about the very specific paper, and depending on, I had obviously to clean this, what I suggested here, this would be a very specific thing, and very specific, and that would help in terms of anything that you write in a review. You say, this is the problem, I think this would address that. And if you don't want to be too prescriptive, and obviously also we as reviewers don't know everything, rarely, you could just say, well, or any other methods that the reviewers, that the authors think addresses the same point. But by that, you have specified the problem very clearly. You have provided a potential solution, which also helps clarify the problem. Often you can understand from the solution, from the suggested solution, what the main point is about. And you are open. That goes back to the point about scientific debate. If the authors provide something else, something more interesting, something better, why not? And you as a reviewer may have learned something from that. So this is pretty straightforward. So I mean, either the authors would agree to changing their title due to this reason or not. And here, this point is really not well formulated. There you would need to tell the authors why you think this is important. So I mean, otherwise it can really be taken up in any direction. For example, you would want to have this as a limitation, that this was not considered, and that the authors should refer to that in the limitation section of their paper or something like that. Moving on to results, so after the method section where we were, that is usually, I think, probably the easiest in some ways, because it's very well structured already. You have the hypotheses, hopefully, from the paper, from the introduction. You have the analytic strategy that has been mapped out in the methods section, and now you basically only have to go through the results and check whether these things actually match up. So did the authors do what they said they would do? Is enough detail provided? Which obviously, depending on quantitative and qualitative methods, means very different things. Are the results and analyses connected to the research? Question and hypothesis. Can you, from the reading of the results, go back to the hypothesis in the beginning? And entailed in that, I mean, this is the section where most of the figures and tables happen. The point about figures and tables obviously pertains to any table and figure in the text, but most usually are presented in the results section. Do the results presented in text and figures and tables match up? are the tables and figures actually needed for their understanding, and anything that can be suggested to make the tables and figures more comprehensible and better to read. And remember always we have the API-A kind of guidelines in the background that say in psychology any table and any figure needs to be interpretable on its own largely. Anything that is feedback in terms of feedback helps to get there is obviously very good and usually appreciated by everyone. Finally, discussion in psychology, it usually has a summary of the main results and some interpretation of the study and the actual findings. And the question is, do the interpretation and the findings really match up? Is there no overinterpretation, overgeneralization going on, things like that? And one thing to check is sometimes does the discussion repeat the results section or present even new results? Neither of these points should usually happen. So that would need some restructuring potentially. Depends sometimes on the case. And then here we come back to the points I made earlier about the introduction and opposing or other views. Is a wider context of the research and results provided. So on the one hand, is it matched to the research and framework that was already presented in the introduction, compared to how the findings are actually matching up with those. And then at the latest here, some discussion would need to happen about what do others think if that is a controversial topic. Then in some way or other, strengths and limitations should usually be covered in the discussion, and that should be fair. And I mean, in both ways, you should be, the paper should point appropriately out what was done well as then on the other hand, on balance, what wasn't so good or what couldn't be achieved. And our future directions in research and practice outlined and meaningful. I don't think that anybody still wants to read the sentence, more research is necessary. I think we all know that. The question would be, for example, what kind of research would be necessary? So being precise and interesting at that point. Otherwise, maybe just leave it out. Although the clinical implications, especially for a journal like psychotherapy research, are obviously quite an important point for a paper to make. References, I mean, usually you probably would be checking some throughout. I mean, if you're interested in the topic and something new is cited, you want to look at the paper and check it out, whether it's referenced in the paper itself and whether the article actually exists online or somewhere. It every once in a while happens that it doesn't. That is then sometimes interesting. Referencing style, you're not supposed to do all kinds of typo correction and so on, but giving a general indication about what could be changed about the referencing style and so on, giving one or two examples about what's not correct is helpful. And again, if you reached the reference list and haven't checked any of the references yet, well, check some, And if you're as methods focused as I am, do it randomly. Otherwise, any algorithm will do. Finally, we haven't talked about reviewing the title and abstract. This is probably just as writing the final version of the summary at the beginning of a review done best last, because then you have a real appreciation of what the paper is about. And there's the obvious question about whether the title reflects the content of the manuscript, and in some ways whether the title is in line with journal's suggestion about how a title should be structured. Some are very specific about that. And well, regarding the abstract, it's usually so self-explanatory what should be in an abstract, but still general questions is the clear definition of the research question and the background there, sample size and recruitment and so on, clear, especially in our context where we want to know, is it patients, is it students and so on, what kind of patients, if there was an intervention, is it at least from a couple of keywords clear what kind of intervention was done, so is the correct paradigms mentioned there. Does the method section point to the design and analysis? Again, not necessarily the total detail, but was it a regression analysis? Was it grounded theory that you used, and so on? These kinds of things should be present in a manuscript, an abstract. Yeah, is the main finding to be found in the abstract helpful sometimes? Yeah, and often, no, that's unfair, not often, but every once in a while you find a abstract where there are so many additional findings in there that you can't really find the main finding anymore. And the conclusion should be based on the main findings, basically the same question with the discussion section mentioned earlier. Yeah, so does the interpretation and the conclusion from the paper bear a positive comparison with the actual results that have been presented? Yeah, so that was a long stretch of information. So that brings to an end the main parts that need to be discussed about a paper in a review. And here's another natural point where I can stop for questions.
That's great, Jan. Well, again, anyone who might want to ask something or even share some reflections with us can do so through the questions tab or by putting your hand up. So I'll quickly scan through here if anyone has any contribution to make. Again, Jan, I think your crystal clear style leaves little to wonder.
That's one way of looking at it. Thank you, Alex. Okay, yeah, then I'll just plow on with the recommendation. With the recommendation, we are basically meaning or describing the thing that you give back to the editor and telling him or her what should be done about this manuscript that you just reviewed. So, and before you reach that, I mean, one good thing is to read your comments in full again. Yeah, so just to make sure that you still understand what you want to say about the manuscript, and to check all the rather woolly and social points that I several times referred to. So, is it constructive? Is it clear? Is it helpful? And so on. Yeah. Also helps not to forget some things. And I mean, generally, if you can afford it and time-wise, yeah, after finishing writing it, just let it sit for 2 or 3 days or whatever, and come back to it before submitting it. I know I myself said something about avoiding unnecessary delays, but this is not necessarily unnecessarily. So it might help you to clarify and to think about it again. And yeah, so the final thing to look at it, reading through it, would you find the review constructive? It doesn't have to be, and you shouldn't lie. Yeah, obviously, if something is not good, it's not good. Yeah, so there's not really anything to be discussed. Yeah, but you should feel free to express this in a manner that helps authors understand why you think it's not good and what could be done about it. Yeah, that leads then to your final deliberation about the manuscript to come to a final recommendation. And I mean, these are all slightly differently worded across manuscripts, but I think these are the main categories that you usually find. Accept, I think, is quite uncontroversial. Yeah, so if you and other reviewers and the editor don't find anything, yeah, but I mean, for your decisions, obviously only you, no change is needed. You have thought about it, know any of the quality standards you know were fulfilled, no questions open, and that entails, I mean, in some ways you don't have to agree with what the authors do. It doesn't need to be the perfect study, obviously, but it's also entailing this notion of the limitations specifically. Yeah, are the authors and the manuscript clear in the limitations what this study doesn't do? And that for some of methodological problems and so on, for some of these, that might go quite a long way actually to make the paper acceptable. And often, as you may already have found out painfully yourself, this is at the end of a longish process. But what is rather more likely that you come to a conclusion is minor revisions. Yeah, so any of these things that I said needs to be addressed. Yeah, so you don't think that there's anything that could be found critically wrong with the study. Yeah, so you don't think that there's any skeletons buried somewhere, and you think, oh yeah, no, this is going to unravel itself completely. It's just some minor detail here and there needs to be added. And just coming back about the limitations and the not perfect study, just adding 2 or 3 points in the limitations that make clear what is actually lacking in this study and should help to see the results with some kind of caveat. Even more likely, at least for me, it's major revisions, or in psychotherapy research terms, revise and resubmit. Yeah, there's a lot of detail lacking. You have the feeling that if you ask for what the sample actually is, you might find out that it was students, and so the whole clinical story of the paper might collapse, or actually the sample size was in the end only 15, not the 500 that they promised, and so on. So you have serious doubts, that this is presentable at this moment, and it can't be just helped by adding some things in the limitations. It also might need reanalysis, it might need additional analysis, might need a rewrite of parts of the introduction section because large parts of the literature were missing, and so on and so on and so on. So the many, why would you say major revisions and not reject? Maybe is what you ask. Well, it might be a very good topic. The data set might be presented as being generally very potent, very promising in answering this question. It might be actually, as the authors claim, the first study doing something that's interesting. All these kinds of things that might point to, it should deserve a second reading, basically. And that's go for this. Reject after review is, mainly when you find that either too many points, basically every second sentence of a manuscript and every bit of the analysis, everything needs to be changed with good reason, or the quality standards cannot be met. So, for example, if, as I think said several times, if the authors want to tell a clinical story but don't have a clinical sample, then it's no way this can be addressed unless they do a new study and get a new sample. So how do you submit this? Well, most of the journals, as I said earlier, have electronic submission systems, and these provide usually text boxes in which you copy-paste your review. And just as a frequent reviewer and editor, I implore you, if you're reviewing, please use them. Again, I hope not to give you ideas, but please don't upload a document unless it's absolutely necessary, because that is always quite difficult to organize and to make authors aware that there is actually another document attached to this review and so on that they need to look at. So that's not helpful. And even worse is writing comments into the PDF document of the article, which I had now a couple of times. That makes it basically impossible for authors to easily address everything that you raise, because that's quite a lot of work to translate the comments from the PDF into their response letter and so on and so on. So just, these letters don't need, or your review usually shouldn't need massive amounts of formatting and layouting, so there's no need to use a text editor or program that does fancy layout. if you're using formulae and so on, it might be just better to just upload the formulae and to refer to them in your review. Anyway, away from these niche problems, maybe what you usually will find is a field that's called comments to the authors, and that's where your review goes. Copy paste your review here, check whether it's structured as you wrote it, probably in a Word or whatever document. This should be the full review, covering all your points, display all your reasoning, so that both the editor, especially at this stage, the editor, and later the authors really understand your recommendation. And again, it should be constructive. So then there's a field comments to editors usually, and the simple rule is do not copy paste the review itself. I mean, you can, but it's not really useful if it ends up only there, because then the editor technically shouldn't be allowed to share it with the authors, and that's probably not what you want. So just as a general rule, just don't copy paste your review there. And in the field instead, you can provide some sentences to the editor stressing one or two main points of your review, so that the editor can a bit easier understand what your recommendation is based on. I'll have an example, I think 3 slides down. So the recommendation itself does not go into the review. That's something to stress. The authors shouldn't see what you recommended. Because you are recommending, you're not deciding as a reviewer. That's a really important difference. That's also good for you in a way, because it takes off some of the pressure. You don't have to break your head and brain by weighing all the options and what it is that you should actually recommend. You should make the best educated expert opinion guess on what the recommendation is, but the editor is the person who needs to come to a decision about the manuscript. So usually you indicate, instead of copy pasting it with your reviewer, so you indicate your recommendation in a separate field. In psychotherapy researchers management system, it's radio buttons where you select from a number of options. Other journals do have drop down menus and so on. So there you select, for example, major revisions. As I said, the brief summary in the editor field can be helpful. But usually your selected recommendation should in some ways match your review. So for example, I mean, I may go away being perceived as the boring quantitative researcher I may be, but if you have loads and loads of comments in your review, it's likely or easily justified that it's major revisions. So the number of points, the more you raise, the more likely it's probably, and the more understandable it is that it's major revisions. Or the severity of the points, so that you raise. I already referred to the mismatch between sample and story. So there basically only one point is enough to say no. This, and on the premise of trying to tell a clinical story with a student sample, this is not going to work. But what could it look like? So you could have a sentence like, I recommend minor revisions for the manuscript as outlined in my review. The only points raised are that research pointing to opposite results than hypothesized by the authors has not been covered in more detail, and some more detail regarding logistic regression needs to be presented. Both can be easily accommodated. So that is something you can add in the comments to editor box, but it's not necessary. Especially if it's, the match between these points being raised and your recommendation will be understood by most editors, I think. The field is very important for two other things. On the one hand, I referred earlier to information on potential conflicts of interest. So if you, in a double-blind review situation, for example, suspect that the review is from a certain group, if the paper is from a certain group, if you have any of the other points to raise where, in terms of your own patent or whatnot, this is the latest stage where you can do that. just to make the editor aware and to take this into consideration when reading your review. If for some reason, sometimes you just realize after starting writing the review that this might not be quite the thing, and you have conflicts of interest. So that's then where you can raise it and clarify it. Usually, if it's really bad, really important conflict of interest, then you should contact the editor in between. And the other thing is, and I referred to that several times, especially during the review of the methods section, just provide information on aspects that you found important but could not evaluate. And so point out to the editor, for example, just taking an example from the slides earlier, this multiple imputation thing, I don't know anything about it, but I think it's too little detail, but I couldn't really point my finger on what to do. Maybe it's important that somebody looks at it. So this could be the editor, him or herself, obviously, if they know about that, or this would be then an indication to have to do some specialist statistics review in that case, or so, and ask somebody just to look at that aspect, for example. And that is something I usually write this quite openly if I'm writing reviews into the sections to the authors as well. I don't know anything about that, but I had the feeling that this point and this point and this point, and then it's clear to everyone, and the authors in that case are maybe also welcome to write in their response letter that I really don't know anything about that. But but if you don't feel comfortable doing that, the comments to the editor field, that's the place where you flag up these kinds of things. So as I said, decision making is then done by the assigned editor, which means in different journals, different things. It may be actually that all the editors have to agree that this is published in the end. Sometimes it's just the associate editor who has handled the process and so on. But for our purposes, let's just think about the assigned editor. He or she reads the manuscript, the reviews, and tries to form an integrated view of these, and then makes the decision, which can, I think mostly it will be in line with at least some of the reviews that have been sent in. Having 3 reviews, a editor might find a minor revisions, major revisions, and to reject the collation of this information into a single decision, unless the reject review is very specific and raises a major point. Not surprisingly, this will be a major revision decision, I think. But apart from that, that's the task of the editor. He or she does that. What you as a reviewer have to remember is you are providing your expert opinion. That's why it's called recommendation and not decision. Based on what you know about the field, you give a appreciation and evaluation of the research, and it's really the thing that you need to do is be clear and sufficiently detailed in your review, so that for anyone reading this, it's clear what you think about that and why. And one final thing also, sometimes, especially young reviewers have difficulties with this recommendation thing. You're rarely the only reviewer for a manuscript. So just with that thought in mind, just relax. Is a good practice would say 2 to 3 reviews overall. So if you make a mistake or miss something, it should be picked up by somebody else, hopefully. Final point, I think, re-reviewing. As I said, if you accept the review, you are kind of expected to accept the re-reviews of the manuscript as well. Many journals ask you today whether you would be willing to re-review the manuscript, but it's obviously quite difficult, especially if you provide a detailed and good review, not to that we can come back as editors to you in the revision phase to have you check whether your points were addressed, whether nothing new came up, and so on. Which leads to the main things that you need to do at that stage. On the one hand, have the points you raised been sufficiently addressed? Has anything new come up that you think is difficult? try to be consistent in your reviews. Yeah, so if on one hand, in the first review, you suggest to do A, yeah, don't suggest to do B in the next round, yeah, unless there's really, really good reason, and then you should explain it usually. And the same is true about basically changing recommendation in a downwards fashion. So if your first recommendation was minor revisions and now suddenly you go major revisions or even reject, this really needs clarification why you think that. And there's in those cases, there are usually very, very good reasons. Yeah. So, I mean, the number of papers where only on the second round you can actually see in detail what the authors did due to changes to the methods section, which then can lead to another major revisions or even a reject because it's just not matching the research question or something like that. It's sizable. Yeah, it happens. But still, you can't just say, yeah, no, I'm going to reject. Now that is something neither the editor nor the authors can really take on board and work with. So, yeah, I think I have 2 or 3 slides to go after this one. So it's a good point for raising questions or discussion again. Maybe, Alex?
Yeah, so you have a question here. It's actually a great question here from Danilo Mogia. I'm sorry, I'm probably destroying names today, back and forth. But the question is it necessary that the reviewer give the foundations for their statements through quotations or references?
Okay, yeah, very good question. That gives I'll give you the lovely it depends response. In general, I would say yes, yeah, because otherwise it's really difficult to understand where you're coming from and who has said, basically you should do this, or this is an appropriate method, or, I mean, I've referred several times to the point that literature is missing. You can't point out literature that is missing without quoting and referencing literature that is missing. On the other hand, there may be points that are really just common sense or just scientific good practice. Yeah, certain things about how to do a regression analysis or something like that, for example, or how the steps of consensual qualitative research should be done, or a bad example probably because you know the paper where you would find that. Yeah, but if it is really about things that are common practice that need to be and commonly understood, or any introductory textbook of a certain method should cover this, then I would say no, it's probably fine. You not necessarily need to reference that, but it always helps, I think, to be clear about, this is the exact type of literature or method that I'm referring to, that I'm as a reviewer are thinking about in this case. Not sure whether that addresses exactly the point, but maybe Danilo can come back.
So if anyone has any other questions, they can put it online.
Yeah.
Jan, while we are waiting for any further questions, maybe I'd like to pose you one question for further reflection.
Oh.
So you talked before about the having to take into consideration the possible bias of the authors. And I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on this, considering that a lot of people submitting papers actually are part of projects that in some fashion they do have a bias, a natural bias towards their approach towards each subject. So when does it become a bias to take notice, or when is it a natural bias that all of us have?
I think we all have these kinds of biases all the time. I mean, confirmation biases and focusing on the stuff we do anyway and so on. I think I would be very happy for people who don't have these. I'm certainly prone to have these things. I think it depends again, and I think there's also a change in the writing style, I would really assume. So I think it's more and more, on the one hand, going towards structuring your manuscripts in a way that you really elaborate your own position in the introduction, and that you try to pick up some of the important points and contrarian points in the discussion section. So I think that is something where I would say today there's quite a shift in balance, that your introduction to some degree may be, and it is okay to be biased and only presenting what is exactly leading to your research question. But especially in really broad interest or journals in psychology that provide as much space as psychotherapy research, for example, does, there is not really an excuse not to try to pick up some other lines of thought in the discussion sections, which may pertain to analytic methods and or interventions, for example. On the other hand, I mean, especially not sure what triggered your question. You might come back on this once I finish. But for example, if you're researching a CBT intervention and it's all happening within that framework, I'm not sure how much you need to specify contrarian views from psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspectives, for example, and all the other way rounds in this combination, obviously, as well, because you're not necessarily making claims that pertain the other paradigms of interventions, I think. So if you're saying we tested this new approach in as a psychodynamic therapy, for example, against these and these groups, there's not much. I mean, there's not much to be gained from the sentence to be added. Yeah, there's also CBT, and there's also other talking therapies, and there's also systemic therapy, and so on. Yeah, so I hope that clarifies a bit where I'm heading. Don't know, Danilo.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. No, that's actually quite clarifying for me.
Okay.
So we have another question here also from Claire Gamble, and she asks also regarding bias. If a journal is single blind only, is it acceptable to request to the editor that you not be given the names of the authors? In a small field, you may be likely to know of the authors.
Yeah, that's obviously a very big debate in general, how blind reviews should be. And I mean, I think in general, the gold standard would still be double blind, but that can't always be implemented. Yeah, I mean, just to give an example, slightly out of psychotherapy research, although I think especially in clinical trials and intervention testing, that's relevant. You can't review the report on a clinical trial without knowing the authors, because you need to go back to the original published protocol. You need to review the statistical analysis plan and so on. And for all these things, you need to know who the authors are, unfortunately, or you will know as soon as you have looked up the protocol and statistical analysis plan and things like that. These are the situations, or these are journals that get these kinds of manuscripts who often have single blind reviews, where basically the reviewer is kept, the authors are kept blinded to to the identities of the reviewers, but the reviewers basically can take as much information on the context as they want. And I think it's mainly then drilling down to Claire's specific question, a question of whether it's possible for the journal. Yeah, so I think it usually would be, but most of these journals already share the names of the authors in their request. Yeah, so if you get the request email or whether you want to review this manuscript. So I think it's a fair request, but whether it can be enacted still, for a specific review, that's a different question, I think. Hope that makes sense.
Yes. Thank you for your answers, Jan. So we don't have any further questions, so if you'd like to continue.
Okay, yeah. So I just turned this miscellaneous points, and one thing that I think becomes more and more important is how you keep track of your activity. So because to some degree, although I'm not overly enthusiastic about that, but it is becoming part of researchers' careers, and it's kind of leaving the kind of corner where it was just expected that you do it, but today it's also sometimes asked how often, what you do in terms of reviewing activity. And it's obviously not easy to really keep track of that and to convey this to well, for example, your employer or to somebody you are just sending an application to. And for yourself, several of the publishers have introduced their own incentive systems, and sometimes it's also on journal level that you can get certificates for high quality or high frequency review activities. You might be named as a top reviewer in one of the issues of that journal, and some publishers have their own recognition platforms where you can collate how many reviews you did for journals, journals active with that publisher. But these are obviously not really good to collate what you did overall. And 2 years, well, no, it's not quite 2 years ago, Open Research and Contribution ID, so which is, I mean, something we are in the UK at least very much encouraged to have. Also early on, which is a unique identifier issued by a charity or foundation, not quite clear about their legal status, but it's a non-profit organization. It's an identifier of you as a person, as a researcher, that should be able to collect all your scientific activity under that number. And they added about 1.5 years ago, and here I'm had linked to a summary assessment from last year of that activity. Also collate all the reviews that you do for journals that have your ORCID, so the Open Research and Contributor ID. And that is reasonably neat because it's done automatically. It doesn't obviously do anything else than collect the number. So you just have then in your report on your profile with them on your page how many reviews you did when for a certain journal. But that's better than nothing, I guess. And another thing which I'm mentioning, because I mean, I make very good experiences with it, and on the other hand, Psychotherapy Research has also partnered with them, is Publons.com. I flagged that name up several times. And what they do, they're platform independent service. So they're not working for only one publisher or so, like publisher dependent platforms, and help you document anything you did as a review. So what you do after you submitted a review, you basically get a thank you email from the journal. It's usually automated from the system, and for most journals, usually you do just forward this email to Publons, and after a while, this review will then be added to your profile. And as I said, Psychotherapy Research has, for example, partnered with them, so there you can just click in the review submission process whether you want to get credit for this or not, and this would automatically be added and linked, and then that's quite handy, which can help then to collect all your activity in one place. They have yearly reviewer competitions, which are at the moment still focused on quantity, so it's mainly about how many reviews you did, but there is obviously room to change that in the future, probably. And they have also Publons Academy, which they provide as a free tool to bring you together with other people from your field who could be mentors and so on to, try and learn how to write reviews. So there are several stages of learning that you go through, some exercises and so on that you do, and then some supervised reviews that you submit, and after that you're a Publons accredited reviewer, if you will. I can't say much about that at the moment. It's just a colleague going through that with me as a mentor. We'll see how good that is, but that is definitely a resource that's out there. And then can end with two things. On the one hand, there's obviously the SPR meeting in Amsterdam, and 2 weeks ago it was confirmed that I have the honor of presenting together with the editors of Psychotherapy Research, Wolfgang Lutz and Jeff Hayes, a workshop, a pre-conference workshop on peer reviewing, which will be slightly different than this. Especially, we have a second part where we have kind of a panel discussion, especially with the views of Wolfgang and Jeff on their experiences of reading the journal and review processes and so on. So I think that will be a very good thing. And I think you will, even if you saw this, already considering or supposing that you learned something from me, you may be able to learn even more than what I told you so far. And I mean, I said I was a editor, and that is, since we talked about conflicts of interests and everything, I argue a certain point in this system, and I'm just going to point you to this slide, which, as I said, will be available on ResearchGate later today. So the whole presentation. And this is just collecting a number of papers and comments that I think are really good resources to think about what peer review really is. There's a lot more controversial writing about peer review than the things that I selected here, but I think they give quite an interesting overview, starting with these two papers from Perspectives on Psychological Science from 2009, which is the first time I really realized that you could do something different than peer review, and that there's maybe something wrong with it. Call me naive till that point, at least. I know, yeah, that's fine, but that's definitely a good read if you're interested in that. And the others are a mixture of simulation and analytical papers that delve into the intricacies of reviews. We already talked about the global burden of journal peer review earlier. And I think the commentary piece down here by Eiko Fried is quite interesting. It mainly refers to APA publishing strategies and so on, or at least 1/3 of the longish blog post, but it's really applicable across the board. It's really a thing to think about. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but I think if you're interested in peer review, that's something you could take note of as an example. And from there, you would find quite a number of different other things and opinions on this topic. Yeah, so I think that's me. We still have some minutes left if there are some final questions. Alex?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan. I learned a lot, and thanks so much for the references also. There's a question here for you from Anna Calderon, and she asks, how long on average do you think a review should be? Of course, it depends on how many comments you have, but what would be too short or too long?
Yeah. Again, it depends. Well, I think for anything that isn't a re-review, you should take the time to write a brief summary and the appreciation, and you probably can't do that under 200 words, I would say. And assuming that this is a very good paper and everything is fine, the appreciation should be a bit longer for the reviewer, for the editor to understand why it is a good paper. And I think that is the shortest review you can write. Then after that, the length is really purely depending on how many points you raise and how much you need to do to evidence them. Yeah, so coming back to Danilo's question earlier, yeah, so how much space do you really need to make that clear, and well, what the authors need to do and why it isn't considered good practice, for example, why it is destroying the internal validity of the study or whatever. And that does also not necessarily have to be long, but each point needs to have this kind of structure of saying, okay, this is the problem. I think this would be a solution. And with that, you're mounting a number of words already. And the most important thing is reading through it. If you think that however short it is, that it conveys exactly the points that you think, evidence, for example, reject. So a reject could also be very short, if it's really a major flaw, but these studies are just really rare. I don't know what my reviews are on average. I'm not trying to promote myself here, but oh yeah, you don't need to look at my Publons profile. You can look at any Publons profile. They should give you an indication of the average length of the reviews. But I would rather think of reading through it and thinking about, did I really clarify the points that I wanted to make? Sorry for slightly sidestepping this question.
Well, yeah, I'm looking here and we're all about out of time, and actually there are no more questions. So
okay.
Let me first of all just congratulate you on your pre-conference workshop, and I really look forward to meeting you in person in Amsterdam. And
thank you.
And finally, let me just thank you so much on behalf of me and everyone here for this great presentation that you gave us, because I learned a lot. So I really look forward to continue this dialogue in Amsterdam.
Lovely. Yeah, me too. Thank you.
So, as everyone knows, I'd just like to finish off by saying that this webinar was recorded. So if you're a member of SPR, you will be able to access the recording at the Vimeo account of SPR. You can watch the entire webinar there. We will inform you on the website when it's available. And we hope to hold the next webinar soon, probably in 2 months. So stay tuned, because we'll inform you of that as soon as possible. So one final silent thank you to Jan. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.